in this episode of the Critical Oxygen podcast.
To me, the guy who's capable of running 210 but ran 220 because he didn't push as hard as he could have, versus the guy who ran 5 hours and he could not have run 4:59, like he gave it everything, the latter was more successful than the former.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Critical Oxygen podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we're joined by David Mehlman, who is an entrepreneur, investor, and avid endurance athlete, where we're going to discuss how you as an age grouper can use technology within endurance sport. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Phil. Excited to be here.
Yeah. David and I met, I think just on Instagram, right? You reached out to me. You were looking for a little bit of guidance, I think, within the was it your first marathon?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So
and I didn't even know that you were working with Moxie at the time. So it was total coincidental.
And it worked out. It was coincidental to both of our benefits, because he at the time was really ingrained in some technological stuff, and I work for Moxie Monitor, which is a near infrared spectroscopy company, for those of you that don't know. But I also have my Critical O2 Instagram, where it was a little bit different. It's a little bit more based on educating people on how to kind of optimize their physiology. So he reached out to me and was like, "Hey, I need some help optimizing my physiology." And it's literally in your tagline. So here we are. So I had to get him on the show because David is one of those people who I think, goes 110% into whatever, it is that he's trying to pursue. And at the time he was trying to pursue his first marathon, and now has since, crushed his second marathon right in Chicago. And, I think you utilize technology in the correct way, where I think a lot of people, they get technology, it's not really utilized in the correct way, and then people are like, oh, well, this stuff is useless or not worth my time. So I wanted to get you on, and I think where we can start is just how did you get into say marathon running? Like what was the impetus that actually guided you there?
So it was pretty random. I'm 41 now, and I ran my first marathon, at 40. I spent most of my career sitting behind a desk, using Microsoft Excel, eating, 2, if I was lucky, usually 3 meals a day at my desk. Pretty sedentary, not the healthiest lifestyle. I was living in New York City at the time. A lot of late nights, either working or being out with friends. Not a lot of physical activity going on, and I'd never really been one for any sort of endurance, and especially any kind of running. I played lacrosse relatively seriously as a kid, all throughout high school. I was going to play in college before an injury. And I chose to be goalie in 7th grade. So I basically traded people hurling hard rubber balls at me as hard as they could in exchange for running.
Right.
So I actively avoided running is probably an understatement. When I got to my late 30s, or I guess mid to late 30s, life catches up with you. I started feeling tired all the time. My, different things started to ache and, were sore. And I just was not feeling great. I decided I was going to make a change in my life and pick up some physical fitness activities. I was going to start to lift weights. And I've literally spent my entire life avoiding all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. Like I was the guy who carried, 2 duffel bags from the curb to the airport check-in and was like, this is what it's like to be an Olympian, I've crushed it. Like, I don't need to smell it, Jim, and I started doing that. I got, as you said, like I'm 110% or 0 type of guy. And I got a nutritionist, almost immediately. And I hired a trainer, and because the background that I had from my friends working out was that they worked out so that they could basically treat their bodies like, human garbage containers on the weekends and stuff like that, and maintain some sort of aesthetic physique. And mm-hmm. that was I mean, I was engaged at the time. I'm obviously now married. That wasn't about it. And I didn't want to do things that were antithetical to the work that I was doing. I wasn't going to wake up early and, do all this stuff to take 2 steps forward, then to just treat my body terribly. And, because even, save, Gustav Eden and all those guys, the even the most active amateurs are training, teens hours a week, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a small percentage of your day is actually spent training. And there's this massive majority where you can undo a lot of that stuff. So I wanted to make sure that how I was living my life was in accordance with or accretive to the work that I was putting in the gym. And I became pretty obsessed with it. And I'm a data person by nature. I work in finance and I've been an analyst my whole life. So not a mathematician, but I look for meaning and reason in things. So fast forward, pandemic came, got a Peloton, like all the typical things that everyone else did. We spent the first summer of the pandemic out at my wife's family's summer home, and there was no Peloton there. And I started riding a family bike just up and down this path. And next thing I knew, I was riding 15 miles, then 20 miles, then 25 miles a few times a week, and just sort of started to see how far can I go. And I wasn't keeping pace. I didn't know what, Garmin or Coros was or anything like that. I had a Whoop, and I was tracking, my distance and my exertion through that. Fast forward a little bit more, we moved down to Miami. I'm standing on the beach with my then, 1.5-year-old son, and we see these distance swimmers coming in. And I'm like, these guys, we've been here for like 45 minutes and they were not here. They were gone when we got here. Like right. They've been swimming a long time. And I just walked up to one of them and I was like, how far did you swim out of curiosity? And he was like, oh, it changes, whatever. Today we swam 5,000 yards or meters. I don't remember what he said. And I was like, that seems impossibly far, yeah. Like in my head, I'm doing the mental math. I'm like, oh my God, like that's almost 3 miles. Like, like these people are insane. I was about to turn 40. I started thinking, I was like, I wonder how far I could swim. And then I was like, I bike on the Peloton all the time. Like maybe I'll do a triathlon. I had a friend who was a triathlete who's done, raced Kona and as an age grouper and has done 10 Ironman races and so on and so forth. I called him up. I said, I have 4 months to my 40th birthday. Can I do a race before that? And he said, not an Ironman. And I said, no, like an Olympic distance. He goes, yeah, but you have to train really hard, et cetera, et cetera. He introduced me to his coach. I just fell in love with the training. Like I fell in love with the routine. I fell in love with the very steep learning curve and improvement curve in the beginning, coming from, sedentary or even just riding a Peloton a few days a week to running, biking, and swimming. And so I did that first triathlon a month before my 40th birthday. And much to my surprise, I was like, I'll just suffer through the 10K, like the running part of it. Like I'll hate it. I'll never run again after that. I remember going out for my first run right by our house here in Florida. I said I was going to run 3 miles at 8-minute pace. I had no idea what 8-minute pace meant relative to like my, critical velocity or anything like that. I got 1.5 miles in. I felt like I was going to throw up. My legs felt like they were going to fall off. I walked home like, slumped shoulders. As you said, I just ran the Chicago Marathon and averaged 8 minutes exactly 8 minutes and 1 second for 26.2 miles. So like that ramp is always exciting. But much to my surprise, I fell in love with the running and I was like, I don't want to cycle on the roads anymore. Swimming was never what I wanted to do much of. Yeah. And before I even competed in the triathlon, I said, I want to run a marathon. And I'm just obsessed with this idea of optimizing my potential and seeing how far I can go. And we can dive into sort of what that means and why I think it's most important to, people say, a lot of runners and endurance athletes say, that comparison is the thief of joy. I really think that comparison is the thief of progress. It just doesn't matter to me what anyone else runs anymore. I used to look at Strava and look at other people's paces and I wonder why they're doing that workout and, oh, I can run this pace, but they can't. And then why are they doing this? And like, it just doesn't matter if the goal is to leave it all out there on the race day. and to do the best that you can possibly do. When from a finance perspective, it's about operations. They talk about capacity utilization, right? Like a factory is running at 80% of capacity. My goal is to run a race at 100% capacity utilization, or as close as I can possibly get to that number, whether that's a 5-hour marathon or, obviously not me, but someone's running a 2-hour marathon, to me, the guy who's capable of running 210, but ran 220 because he didn't push as hard as he could have, versus the guy who ran 5 hours and he could not have run 4:59, like he gave it everything. The latter was more successful than the former because he left everything out there. He gave it everything he had. He maximized his potential. So for me, it's all about maximizing that potential. And that's obviously the segue into working with people like you and trying to figure out what physiologically are my limiters, or what is my limiter, and how can I train in order to find adaptation with respect to that limiter in order to increase my capabilities there. And I love the data. I think a lot of people, I'm in no shape or position to be criticizing anyone else's training, nor would I ever want to, but I think a lot of people get it wrong. There's vanity involved. There's self-doubt involved. That sort of permeates into like self-abuse in a lot of cases. Whether it's zones or paces or whatever, I think a lot of people are probably training way too hard, or too hard too often. And so I've just fallen in love with this idea of optimizing myself and following people like you and a bunch of other, physiologists and coaches and stuff like that.
That's fantastic. I love your outlook on, I'm trying to maximize my, what was the financial term that you said?
Oh, capacity utilization.
Yeah, I'm trying to get to 100% capacity utilization, and that's your marker of success. Am I getting?
I can't run a 240. I'm never going to run a 240.
Well,
like it's impossible.
Well, right. So
maybe not impossible.
I'm going to correct you there, and I'm going to say it's probably not impossible, but maybe right now, maybe in the physiological body that you have at this moment, it's impossible.
Right.
But if you continue to do exactly what you're doing, contacting the professionals in the field, talking to individuals and getting new insights, and then taking a pragmatic approach to training, as opposed to just being like, oh, I saw what this pro was doing, so I'm going to emulate that. And we can talk about how that's kind of a messed up mindset for a lot of us, but it's how do you get the most out of your body on any given day? And what is the best for your body on that given day? Because it's most of the time, like you were saying, people train too hard too often, and then that results in them, plateauing, getting injured, getting sick, other things along those lines. So, perhaps by backing off, or just learning, when to back off, what sort of signals, can you use? And this is where technology, I think, plays a really major role. Is it gives you the ability to calibrate or recalibrate the way that you interact with your body with what is actually being told to you on your watch, on your phone, whatever that is.
Yeah. I think the human ability to self-assess is generally pretty bad. Right. And so I think that that's true. I also think that the metrics with which someone describes or assesses how they feel and your physiological readiness or adaptation are two very different things, right? So I think the ability to assess them is wrong, and I think people are looking at the wrong things in general. Like, I woke up feeling tired today. That doesn't mean that I did not have the proper recovery to go out and run a threshold session or something like that. It just means that I'm a little tired today. Conversely, I woke up, I jumped out of bed, ready to tackle the day, does not mean that my body is ready to go run. I work out I do my workouts on Wednesdays. They're hard,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like I go hard. I am not, like hands on knees falling over, but like there's big volume in those days. There's, like Wednesdays are usually a warm up, a relatively long tempo, intervals, which is a standard, running thing, tempo into intervals, and then back to a tempo.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a 5 mile tempo, 6 by 800 meters, and then a 3 mile tempo after that, obviously with rest in between. Like you cannot will your way to adaptability,
Mm-hmm.
right? You cannot say, and I think that's the big mistake that people make is, like you just said, like they look at the pros, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like what are these people doing? I think, we were chatting offline about this, but like, there's a Canadian marathon record holder who just came out yesterday in advance of the New York City Marathon saying that he runs 170 to 180 miles a week. Kelvin Kiptum, who just set the world record in Chicago, who my 3.5-year-old son graciously asked me when I got home, was I just behind that guy? I was like, yeah, I was just behind him. I was like a little bit behind him. Yeah. He was like on a plane by the time I finished. But he runs 180 miles a week. Like, so I think there's this misguided concept that if some of something is good, then more of it has to be better, mm-hmm. right? And that you're on a vector when in fact it's probably parabolic, right? Yeah. There's a point where the return is great. There's a point where the return is still positive, although it is less than it was at a lower level. There's a point where it's plateaued and there's absolutely no incremental return. And then there's a point where it's actually detrimental mm-hmm. to you. And so you see Molly Seidel, Kira D'Amato, any of these incredible women, hands on knees, in Flagstaff or wherever they are, hands on knees. Like if I had to run 10 more feet, I'd die. And going, and the average age group are saying, that's how I should feel at the end of my session. I could not disagree with that more strongly, right? Their body's ability to get close to that 100% capacity utilization in training and recover mm-hmm. is so significantly greater than mine or maybe yours or the average person's. We talked a lot about triathletes, Christian and Gustav, like those guys, they can recover so much better just through sheer reps and volume mm-hmm. over years and years and years. They also don't have jobs. Like mm-hmm. that is their job. They sleep. And if you listen to them talk, it's like I am training or I'm sleeping, mm-hmm. Or I'm eating, basically, that's it. And so it's not a question of, if you're a coach or something like that, like it's not a question of same workout, slower pace mm-hmm. for the slower runner. The volume is different. The recovery times are different. It's a totally different thing. And people think that if I train harder or train more, I'm going to run a marathon faster. Mm-hmm. And it's just not. I mean, it's not the case. It's just, it's simply anatomically, physiologically incorrect.
Yeah. Or the idea that if I just train as close to what this professional is doing, I'll get better in that sense. And, you said it exactly, that fractional utilization it's much higher in these elite level individuals because they've been training for so much longer. Like I can almost guarantee you, like Calvin Kiptum and what's the Cam Levins?
I can't remember his name.
Cam Levins. Yeah. Those guys, so if we're talking about like, physiological thresholds and stuff, their VO2 max is really high, but their second threshold is probably butted up almost to that
right
VO2
up against
max.
It.
So when they go from their second threshold to VO2 max, it's not that much more in terms of like fatigue accumulation. Right. Whereas for me and you, our VO2 max, is increasing, right? But our second threshold is substantially lower than that. So that gap between our second threshold and our VO2 max is any work that we start to do closer to VO2 max is just going to be that exponential kind of creep up to that fatigue, right? Then it's going to make it harder to recover. But yes, go ahead.
Yeah. They also run their easy runs easy. I cannot tell you how many people I see on Strava, and they say, and I know them like personally, and I know what their marathon pace is, and I'm making up numbers. This is a 3:30 marathoner, so that's 8 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll post something, easy 8, easy 10 miles, whatever. And it's like at 8:24.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, there's nothing easy about that for you. That's your marathon pace. Yeah. That's a quarter of a standard deviation away from your marathon pace. Mm-hmm. Like, there's nothing easy. But for whatever reason, they don't want to post a slower time. They don't have enough time to run, that slow and do the same amount of volume, whatever it may be, right? But you can't fool your body. Mm-hmm. Like you just can't. And at some point, the rent is due. Yep. And that's injury, that's blow up, that's mental fatigue. Yeah. It's burnout. It's something you cannot push your body. Alan Couzens, who we both know of, obviously, like stress plus rest, and you've told me this a million times, right? Mm-hmm. Like the rest is just as important as the stress. Yep. Yep. And that rest doesn't mean lying in a cryo chamber ice bath with leg sleeves on and all of that stuff. It doesn't mean rest is part of the easy running and all of that mm-hmm. stuff too, and the cross training and all of that stuff. Letting your body recover is massively important. And similarly, stress is not just all out 5K pace or faster. Mm-hmm. Right? If your easy run should be 2 to 3 minutes slower than your marathon pace, based on whatever your limiter is, your heart rate, or whatever you determine, or you have someone like you determine for you, and you're running, let's say your marathon pace is 8 minutes and your slow pace should be, to stay in zone 2 on heart rate, and the 5 zone scale should be sub 135. And that equates to roughly 10 minutes. And I want to get into that in a second, but like running at 9:15 is too much stress on your body. It's more like a chronic stress than an acute stress, but it's still too much stress.
Yes. I want to dive into that, because something that I talk about, I've at least talked about it once on this podcast, is exercise, right, is a massive stress. Like, if we actually like mm-hmm. look at all the different physiological characteristics that are happening, if you just told somebody, hey, this person's heart rate is 180, their breathing rate is this, their their lactate is this, their blood acidosis is plummeting, like, people, if you didn't know they were exercising, you'd be like, oh my gosh, this person is gonna die.
Dying. Yeah, exactly.
But the difference is that exercise is an acute stress. It goes away. It should go mm-hmm. away. Whereas things like excess adipose tissue, having or mm-hmm. developing, high blood glucose for extended periods of time, those are chronic stresses that then the area under the curve for those stresses adds up to the point where your body can't recover from it. It never gets alleviation from it. And what you just said with this idea that, when people run too hard too often for their own physiology, you're changing that acute stress to more of a chronic stress.
To a chronic stress, exactly.
And so then you're minimizing your body's ability to recover. And another thing you said is you cannot will your way to adaptability. You have to stress your body, because that's actually going to decrease performance. Then you have to rest and recover enough mm-hmm. to have super compensation and actually get better. So like the stock market and finances, if you look at over time, right, the stock market trend is going up, but every day, it's bouncing all over the place. That's exactly how your physiology is when you're training, but the trajectory should be positive if you're actually implementing it correctly.
I think of I couldn't agree more. I think of it as, life is a sine wave, right? It's cyclical. To your point, you're hoping that you're the mathematician, not me, but the it's not the slope, but the trajectory of that sine wave. It's going, it's like this. Yeah. It's going sine wave, but going up. Each peak is higher or not. It's not going to be that uniform, obviously. So I absolutely agree. It is a cyclical thing that's hopefully has a positive general trend line.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is if you look at if you zoomed out and you looked at it, this may be like, training cycles, right? So like training, marathon, recovery, training, marathon, recovery. If you zoom in, that line is composed of micro sine waves.
Yep.
So within one block, there's week 3 was bad, week 4 was good, week 5 was okay, week 6 was bad.
Yep.
So like it's sort of like this image of like you zoom in, and then that big sine wave is made up of a bunch of little sine waves, which is also made up of each day and then each hour and then each intra workout,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like you have a 20-mile workout. Do all 20 miles feel the same? Under zero circumstances is that possible,
Nope.
right? So that's the sine wave of this workout. It's part of a sine wave of a week, which is part of a sine wave of a month, which is part of a sine wave of a training block, which is part of a sine wave of your life as a runner.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. I love that.
And you just have to look at it cyclically. And for someone like me, I think I probably jumped the shark a little bit with technology because I believed that if I did everything right and trained properly and exactly on my thing, then the outcome of the race was almost a foregone conclusion, right? I've rested, I've done this. My grandfather used to love professional horse racing, and I remember being a kid and saying like, well, if this horse is I don't remember what the numbers were, like a 2-to-1, and that horse is a 20-to-1, like clearly the 20-to-1 has no chance, like this is a much better horse. Mm-hmm. And he always used to say, well, that's why they run the race, mm-hmm. Because anything can happen on race day. Mm-hmm. And I sort of forgot about that, where it's like, okay, all you need to do is train according to a plan, eat the right stuff, sleep the right amount, run the right amount at the right paces, and you will figure out this critical velocity, which you can then just go on race day and just set it and forget it and run that. And those are all the inputs. And then it's just a mathematical equation. I think that's one of the shortcomings, or not, I shouldn't say shortcomings of technology, but I think it's one of the shortcomings of the way people use technology, mm-hmm. because that is like a baseline, all else equal. Mm-hmm. I live in Miami. It is 95 degrees with 90% humidity in the summer. To assume that those numbers are going to be the same as they would be in,
Chicago,
Montana in the winter, or Chicago or whatever, is just lunacy, obviously. But I also, the really important thing about that around technology, I think, and we can obviously dive into this more, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know because you probably taught me most of this stuff, is people are obsessed with output metrics.
Yes.
And they really should be focused on the input metrics. Mm-hmm. Everyone wants to look at the speedometer. Mm-hmm. How fast is this car going? What you should be looking at in training, not in racing, in training, is how much effort am I putting in? And how much effort does it take to create a certain output, whether that's pace or whatever. Mm-hmm. And people go, oh, yeah. Like, I get it, like heart rate. And then they look down at their watch and that number's way too slow for them.
And then they just ignore it.
And they ignore it, yep. Right? Or they go, in order to stay in zone 2, I need to be at 12 minutes or 8 minutes. Or, there are some runners whose zone 2 is probably 7 minutes or lower than that.
Or on the flip side, walking, right?
Or walking, sure, yeah. I know a really great coach who works a lot with breathing, and he says that a lot of his age groupers, he coaches triathletes. He said a lot of his age groupers, he tells them to find the flattest area that they can, which is usually actually a shopping mall, mm-hmm. And just walk around for 2 or 3 hours. Yeah, because for people who are not adapted athletes, right? The untrained athlete, zone 2 is really hard to get into. I mean, there's no shame in my paces. I ran a marathon at 8-minute pace over the summer down here it's super hot. There were many days when zone 2 was 12 minutes a mile.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like I'm going backwards.
Mm-hmm.
It is so boring. It is so tedious. But again, what is your goal?
Yeah.
If your goal is truly to run the fastest race that you can and get to that 100% capacity utilization, you cannot will your way to it. You cannot trick your body. You have to do what is necessary to get the physiological adaptations.
Mm-hmm.
Saying, I know I have to run at 12 minutes, but I'm just going to run at 10 minutes because I don't want to be out here as long, that's your choice. But don't expect the progress to be made, or don't expect the adaptations to occur, right? It's just, it's not how it works.
I think, and to build off of that, I think in the beginning, people can kind of get away with, going too hard because your stress bucket. I was literally just talking about this on the last podcast. Your stress bucket is not over full yet.
Right.
But if you continue, and in the beginning, it's like literally anything you do is going to result in a positive adaptation because you're going from nothing to something. And but if you maintain this idea then that, if only I run faster, I will continue to get better and adapt, you eventually run into issues. And I had this with people on my cross country teams in the past, where it would be, really talented athletes who would never go slower. They would always be like,
Right.
okay, well, I'm going to run my tempo runs and I'm going to be in the front, and I'm going to run my slow runs and I'm going to be in the front. And then we get to our interval workouts and they would be the first ones to tap out because they were just always burning the candle at both ends. And
look at Ryan Hall. I mean, he talks about it in his book, Run the Mile That You're In. I mean, U.S. marathon record holder, U.S. half marathon record holder. I think both of those records still stand and have stood for a while. He talks about it. He would come back from summer and crush everyone on his team at Stanford in workouts for the first 2 months of the season, and then get absolutely destroyed by them by the time like the big meets were coming around because his body was shot. And it goes back to what my first running coach, this guy Nick, who's an incredible coach and an even better human being, if possible, he used to say to me all the time, because I was obsessed with those numbers, because it's extrapolatory for a lot of people. If I can't run a 5 mile 7:30, 5 mile 7:30 tempo followed by this, followed by that, it means that I'm not going to be able to run a 3:30, right? And so people can't help but extrapolate that. And he would always say to me, you're not proving fitness in your workouts. You're building fitness. Proving fitness comes on race day and race day only. And if you're trying to prove fitness in your workouts, you are not getting the stress and the adaptation that you're looking for. And, I could go on, Alexia Pappas talks about it all the time, a third of your workouts are going to be killer, a third are going to be fine, and a third are going to suck.
Yep.
And you can't just take that last data point. And I am still wrangling with this a lot. I'll go out and I'll crush a workout and go 3:30s in the back.
Right.
I go out and I can't make it through a workout and I go, I don't know if I can run 4 hours. Like, what's the point? And that's that, to your point about technology, like that's the reason that people do that is going back to what we were just talking about. They're focused on the output. This time, I wasn't able to do this time. Were you able to get this? And that's where sort of like the science meets the art. Were you able to get that, RPE, that perceived exertion? Were you able to get to where it felt like it's supposed to feel at mile 16 of a marathon, at mile 20 of a marathon? It doesn't matter whether that's 8 minutes or 6 minutes or 12 minutes. The goal of the training is to get yourself to that point and become accustomed to the feeling of that amount of stress,
right,
regardless of the output of that. So that's why I always say, like, focus on the input metrics, not on the output metrics.
Yeah.
Like, is your heart rate, at 5K pace when it should be a marathon pace? Doesn't matter what the pace is.
Right.
You want your heart rate, if that's the metric that you're using, to stay at that marathon goal pace heart rate. regardless of the time. And I've done a lot of stuff. Like I've taken a lot of things off my watch face. Like I don't look at paces a lot anymore, because it's very hard. You know, you go out and you tell yourself, oh, I'm going to leave it on there, but I'm not going to care what it says.
Yeah, I'm not going
it's
to look
supposed
at it.
to be, no. And you're just like, oh, you know, like out of the corner of your eye. And it says, you're supposed to be running at 6:30. You're supposed to be doing 6:30s. Like that's my 5K pace. And it's 6:45. You're like, oh, better speed it up. Yeah. Even though that 6:45 feels like it's supposed to feel, right? On a perfect day, that's what a 6:30 feels like. Today is not a perfect day. So that's what a 6:45 feels like.
Right.
And if you extrapolate that, the 6:30 on that day feels harder than it should.
Yeah.
Harder than what you're looking for.
Yeah.
And people, the ego and the self-assurance of proving your fitness every day, every week, every session, every whatever is one of the biggest killers of, you know, training for, I think, a lot of people.
I 100% agree. There's a lot of really awesome things I want to unpack there. So just as it's easier said than done, exactly like what you were saying. I've been doing this workout. I just moved to an awesome new property where I have a 2-mile out and back. I go down, it's a mile, and then I can come back up and it's a mile of a hill. So it's 500 feet of elevation gain. And I love it. It's so great. It's so great. But the problem is I wear a stride on my shoe because I wanted to see, okay, what is my output? And I have my heart rate monitor on. And then I also time myself on each loop with the idea that, you know, so this is where I'm trying to prove my fitness. And I'm not posting it anywhere or anything like that, but I'm like, okay, I'm going to go out and I'm going to see, you know, it normally takes me about 7 minutes to get to the bottom. And then I'm like, okay, well, we got to push to the top. And so that's been getting to this, it's this proving fitness of I have to beat each loop, or I have to beat what I did Wednesday on Saturday. And I think that if I going forward now after this conversation, what I want to do is I want to switch that mentality to just trying to get, you know, that effort in. Like I want it to feel like a hard tempo effort, but not something where I'm just like absolutely gasping for air when I get to the top, because I rest.
Or what does your heart rate get to? Or what, or, you know, like what is the taxation on your body from doing that? Right. Like that's the goal. We're taxing our body, stressing our body in order to build back stronger. Like if you think about it as a mathematical equation, future fill is current fill times some amount of stress, right? But again, it's parabolic. The more stress doesn't equal a greater value of future fill, right? And so you have to look at that. Like I'm thinking about a 500 foot. I mean, I again live in Miami. I run there's a 10-mile loop that I run that has 60 feet of total elevation gain in 10 miles. So we're living in opposite universes here. When I was training for New York, I used to have to run back and forth over a bridge that takes you to Miami Beach. And that was the only place that you can find any elevation here. And so it's a very different world, but we deal with extreme heat and extreme humidity and stuff like that. And it's that same thing. Like, I remember training, you know, fall marathons are hard because we train through the summer here. And I remember talking to my coach and being like, I don't know what I was thinking. I don't have 3:30 because I couldn't hang on to, you know, this, I think it was a 7:30 for 5 miles. It's like, I couldn't hang on. He's like, David, that prescription is like on a bluebird day. Right? Like you need to alter that, like, because 7:30 in the hellscape that you live in August is a 7-minute mile. Like that. You're right. You can't run a 7-minute mile for 5 miles, like, or else you'd be a faster runner. You know, I grew up playing a lot of, not grew up, but in my post-college years, I played a lot of golf. My brother is an avid golfer still. And I mean, I just remember many rounds of golf with him coming, you know, we didn't live at home after college, but we all lived in New York, and seeing my parents and something. And my dad is not a golfer, but a sports fan. And us, like, sort of my brother and I lamenting around, if I would have made that putt and that, this, and my father would look at us and go, you'd be a better golfer. Like, what do you mean? Like it's the same thing with running. Like, like if I could run a 7-minute, marathon, I'd be a 3-hour marathon.
Right.
Like it's just that's just the reality. And so it goes to that willing thing. I just want to show that I can do it. And like you're asking your body to do a lot more than is actually prescribed of it, right? If you're not taking into account, half of my run was up a 8% grade hill. Like, of course you can't run 730 up that hill like you can on flat road. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And I think that's part of the problem with data. And I think you can get a lot of people have enough information to be dangerous, and actually it's detrimental to them, right? Because they don't really know what the data mean. Or, and before I started working with you and other people, I think I was probably just as guilty of this. But like, I have so many friends who wear a Whoop or an Aura or, and they're like, oh, this means this. And I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Like, no, it doesn't, and I don't, try to tell them it's not my job or they don't care. But like, that's the danger of a lot of these devices is people think they're gospel, which they're not from like a data acquisition standpoint. And there's an old saying, in the land of blind men, the one-eyed man is king. And so, you have all these people who have just run, just up and down the street for years with maybe like a G-Shock or a Timex Ironman or whatever. And now it's like, oh my God, this thing tells me my HRV and like it has to be accurate. Right. It's like, no. Maybe it's longitudinally consistent. It's certainly not accurate. But even the interpretation of that data, I guess my point is that data without the proper interpretation can be worse than no data at all. And you see runners doing it all the time. My watch told me this. My watch told me I'm recovered.
Yeah. My Garmin watch said my VO2 max is 54. And it's going up,
right.
And it's like, how did it,
yeah.
but again,
how does it possibly know?
Yeah. And I 100% agree with that. I think the bottom line, or at least what I think about data is a compass to guide and inform your training. And you need both that, the internal and the external variables in order to get a better picture, but you need to listen or to have that calibration from those internal variables, whether it's as simple as, using heart rate or a little bit more complicated using blood lactate or NIRS. You need something that is telling you what your internal load is, because that gives you a better idea of what the actual stress internally is. And something that I've gotten not into like huge heated arguments, but like, moderate arguments with people who are just like, oh yeah, like I think heart rate is useless because it's so sensitive to the heat. It's so sensitive to if I'm hydrated. It's so sensitive to the, this, that, and the other. I'm like,
you mean everything that's important to running a marathon?
Yeah. It's like, oh, it's working. Like whereas like power output and speed are not sensitive to that. So people, so people always come to me. They're just like, well, if my heart rate or my zone 2 heart rate is determined at 130. Yes, there's probably a little bit of a range, maybe 125 to 135, right? But if you determine your zone 2 heart rate is 130, and then you go out and you run, say, for example, here, flat ground, it's 55 degrees, then you're probably going to have a faster output variable than if I came down to Miami, not heat adapted or anything like that, and then tried to run at 130 beats per minute at 90 degrees pace. 90%. My pace would have to be lower because the stress on your body is so much higher in order to cool yourself, in order to maintain adequate blood flow to the skin and other things like that.
Exactly.
And that is by design. That is taking into account your internal load. And So I love what you're saying there. I think I certainly think there are times in the season, like times where you should do a workout towards something like pace versus something like the
Mm-hmm.
internal variable. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
value in both, but also measuring what's the internal load for that is also important, because then you start to get a picture of, okay, well, my goal is to run, a 3-hour marathon. I want to get a BQ qualifier here, right? I need to go do a workout that is going to be close to 7-minute pace. It's
Mm-hmm.
6:51, right? I
So
think.
yeah, it's 650
Yeah.
something.
So what you could do is you could say, okay, well, if I run this 6:51 pace, in conditions that are going to be similar to race day,
Mm-hmm.
if my heart rate isn't staying relatively stable over the course of those intervals, then I know internally my physiology is
Right.
not ready for that, at least on that given day, in that given moment.
Yeah.
So,
That cardiac drift, right?
mhm,
Like I ran the same pace for 15 miles and my heart rate continued to climb the whole time. Like your body's working too hard,
your body is
right?
working
Like your
harder and
body
harder and harder. And then,
harder
yeah,
to maintain the same pace. So
mhm,
like by definition, that's not your steady state,
right.
And like I actually have, I think I've shared this with you. Like some of my proudest runs are long, easy runs. And I don't remember the term that you had used, but for the opposite of cardiac drift, where you maintain the same pace and your heart rate goes down
Ooh,
over time,
I've
right?
never seen that, but that would be,
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I misspoke. Where your heart rate stays the same and your
mm,
pace
mm,
increases. Right? Yeah, yeah. No, not your heart rate going down.
yeah.
I'm sorry.
I was going to
But
say
you're
that would be
able to
impressive.
run. No, that would be very impressive. Where you're able to run at the same heart rate and pick up speed over time.
Mhm.
So you're able to run faster at the end at the same heart rate as you were at the beginning. Like your body is reacting positively to that,
Mhm.
right? And I think the other thing about the two other things that I would say are, number one, I understand it's very hard for a lot of people to do like a real limiter test, right? Like they don't
Mhm.
have access to a VO2 master or a Moxie monitor or whatever. But I think it's really important for people to take it very seriously, because training on the wrong metric, if that's not your limiter, is not going to help you improve your limiter,
Mhm.
right? Like if your limiter is heart rate. So like let's say you and I are both running together and your limiter is heart rate, right? And so, your zone 2 heart rate is 130, mine is 140, but my SMO2 or tidal volume or whatever it may be, that's my limiter. By only focusing on my heart rate, I'm
Mm.
not getting the adaptation that I need in my breathing. If I have like if I have if my limiter is more respiratory,
Right.
and so I think it's really important, because not that you're wasting time or anything like that, but
You kind of
you're
are.
not
Yeah,
optimizing. Yeah, you kind of
you're
are.
spinning your wheels.
And I think that there's an important distinction, and this is going to sound contradictory, but there's also this concept of like, don't major in the minors, right?
Mhm.
And for the average person, and I don't mean average speed, right? Because I'm very average when it comes to speed. I would say I'm not average when it comes to training regimen and appetite for data and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But like, I am not an elite runner or a sub elite runner or a Boston qualifier or any of those things. I'm a middle of the pack runner. For your average runner, just running, slow, easy, conversational most of the time, and running fast sometimes, is going to help you improve,
Mhm.
right? You're going to get faster, fitter, whatever, more adapted just by doing that, because it's directionally, there's that Pareto principle, 80-20
Mhm.
type of thing. And if that's your goal, then that's awesome. And you should, and you're saying like, it is a mental, emotional stressor for me to have to worry about my heart rate all the time. And then you know what? that's what you should do, and you're doing amazing, and you should keep doing that, and you should be super proud of yourself. And by the way, the guy who has the newest sneakers and 14 gadgets hooked up to him is no more dedicated and no more deserving of anything that comes from his running than you are than what comes from yours. Like, there's no way that that's the case. But if your goal is to get that 100% capacity utilization, then you really need to, the degree or the specificity around which you have your limiters and your training metrics and all that stuff, the greater the specificity, the greater the improvement. Like, that's just, it's a mathematical equation, and you're going to do better. So I understand when they say don't major in the minors. I think that also is unique to each person, what their minors are and what their majors are.
Right.
And for me, that is a major. Right? Like worrying about my heart rate on my easy runs, worrying about my SMO2 and my warm-ups, like those are my majors, right? And it may not be someone else's, and that's totally fine. I was talking to Alistair Brownlee once, who's the only person ever to win 2 gold medals in the Olympics in triathlon. He's the nicest guy in the world. And I was talking to him about an idea for a business and just analysis in general. And I said, there are these moms and dads out there who have, multiple kids and jobs, and, they're trying to run the fastest race that they can, or, complete the fastest triathlon that they can. And for them, it may not be as important it is, for you. And he was like, it's way more important for them. Like, for them to be healthy and feel good and be energized. Like, I'm playing a game, and granted, it's his livelihood, it's his profession, but he's like, that is, for those people, being able to say that, like, they're getting the ROI on their time from their training is way more important to them than it is to me. And so
has to be maximized.
I agree. It has to be maximized. And so it just depends on who you are and what's important to you. And I think that's like the first, if I were to ever coach people, which I don't think I ever would, which is good news for all the runners out there. But like, that would be my first question. Like, what is important to you? Like, what are you trying to get out of this? Because it's just how hard you can push that person, how hard they want to be pushed, what things you care about, what things you measure, all of that stuff is just different for everyone. I think that's the most important part, because you see those people crossing the finish line in 6 hours. Their smile is just as big as Kelvin Kiptum's crossing in 2 hours and 35 seconds, setting a world record.
Yeah. I think that's where it always should start. And then from there, what you can do is you can start to figure out what technology is going to fit, guiding them to get to their goals. And if you are somebody who is looking to, get a little bit more kind of into this optimal training, kind of like David was talking about, I highly recommend doing some level of physiological profiling, physiological testing, limiter testing, anything like that. If you have any questions actually about that, reach out to me and we can set up a little consult, because I truly think that is the place to start with people, is do a physiological test and then know what your body, like where these different zones are occurring and everything like that. Stop taking chances.
Retest.
And retest. Yeah. So
because you will improve.
Yes. And David,
and those things will change.
David, I want to talk to you about this offline. I know you're kind of on a strict schedule, so we'll wrap it up, and maybe we'll have David on again, because this is a phenomenal conversation. I love talking to you, man.
Yeah, likewise. I'm happy to come back anytime. We could, you and I have spent hours and hours talking about this. Yeah. I'm sure we could spend more.
Yeah. So you can catch me on Instagram at critical02. As always, direct any comments and questions over there. You can catch David on Instagram as well at dmehlo. So DMEHLO on Instagram. So if you have any questions on his journey, his training journey, other things like that, reach out to him. He's obviously a super nice guy, and I'm not just saying that because he's on the podcast. He really is, and he means
Please
well.
Do. The best part about this whole journey for me has been getting to know people. The running community is unlike any community I've ever met in my life, and so many people have helped me. I ran New York City stride for stride with a girl that I first met at 2 years old in preschool, and it was her 21st marathon, and she's a 3-hour marathoner.
Wow.
And we ran New York in 3:43, and she literally almost was carrying me the last few miles. And it's an incredible community. So anything I can do to help anyone or just chat with anyone, I'm always happy to.
Yeah, that's awesome. And with that, like I said, if you guys have any questions, please let us know, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.